This is the Analog Gamers Podcast with your hosts.
I'm Shane.
And I'm Brent.
I'm Frank.
So today in our podcast, we're going to talk about a subject near and dear to my heart. And one of the places I kind of started before we got into a big collection is role-playing games. The most popular out there, the one that almost everybody knows the name of, whether they know anything else about it or whether they like it or not, is Dungeons and Dragons. It's a popular one that's been out many, many years and has gone through 5 generations now of rule changes and complexity changes, and everyone has their favorite on what they like to play. And I think everyone around the table has played it.
Yep.
I know from my perspective, I've mostly played Rule Editions 4 and 5. Shane?
I don't know, whatever you have been Dungeon Master for me for.
So Shane's played 5.
I played the original rules and the advanced D&D rules. So we're at the extreme.
You've hit the spread.
Yeah, we've hit this.
So we're missing some important ones in the middle that some people will hate us for, but that's okay. As you heard, I've been DM for Shane before. I don't know that I do a good job at it, but he at least got the flavor of the game, if not the storytelling aspect.
There were some good voices, especially for the goblins.
So have you guys played any other ones?
Any other role-playing games? Or...
Yeah.
Yeah, so I know all of us together, we played the Pathfinder card game. So I've played that.
So I'd put that aside because that's not purely role-playing game.
It's role-playing with cards, I guess. I don't know that I have.
So I haven't. I've read rule sets for many. Problem is getting a group together because it takes time and energy there.
Right.
I've read the rule sets on Mistborn role-playing game and really like it, but then I like the book and the story, so there's no surprise there. But I haven't ever actually managed to get a group together to play any others.
I mean, I've cheated and played World of Warcraft, which is an online whole nother genre, which we're not going to dig into, but I think that would be my only other experience in role-playing.
So I played back in the mid-'80s. There was a system by Iron Crown Enterprises, which is since defunct, and it was called the Rollmaster system. And it allowed for fantasy role-playing it changed combat primarily and character generation eventually. In terms of its fundamentals, I think all role-playing games are the same. So one of you two, pretend I've never heard of a role-playing game. I have no idea what you're talking about. Describe what it is.
So traditionally a role-playing game is a storytelling game. You have one person who is running the game. They are in charge of everything. They build the world. In the case that they buy a scenario and learn the world. They control the characters or the enemies that are going against the players. But the players are a gang of adventurers or a gang of treasure seekers, and they're working together to conquer whatever obstacles the one person throws at them. One of the huge benefits of the role-playing genre, though, is that it's usually an open sandbox. The person in charge has to be ready for those characters to decide they're not going to do whatever they have planned that day and go run off and decide they want to go wench some tavern somewhere. So, the main theme is it's a group of players playing in an open world that someone's storytelling about.
I love that you use the phrase work together because it's almost like in role-playing game, this cast of characters is stuck together by circumstance. And sometimes the characters hate each other. And they will backstab and steal at any chance they can get with one another based on their character traits. So they're playing together in the sense of they're all stuck in this world together, but not necessarily cooperating with one another or working towards the same end, which I think I really enjoyed about some of the role-playing I've done.
So it's interesting you say that because I've seen that go both ways. And some of it has to do with how much of the role part of role-playing people really get into, right? So in all of these games, regardless of the genre, the fiction genre they're generated in, you have something that describes the physical traits and the mental traits of your character, but their backstory, what makes them who they are, is pretty open. By and large, there's nothing there, unless the game master has something specific that they have to because they want that in the game, and they request you to do that, you get to do whatever you want. But I've seen people who are very mechanical about playing this, and they don't really play their character. They really just play as a player, and their character's personality doesn't shine through. So it's interesting that you say that, because in my mind, that's when role playing really shines, is when people really get into the roles. Otherwise, you could be playing any other board game.
Well, and I think in all of the instances that I've played, so I've played one long campaign where Brent was the DM, and then one we just sat down for like 2 hours and played a campaign on New Year's Eve. And in both those circumstances, I think everybody got into their characters and were really playing as their character. I think of my friend Tommy, who was like a little dwarf warrior or something like that, and he was just a jerk the entire time as his character, and it was fantastic. And then my friend Josh, who I forget what he was playing, but I think he was a rogue or something like that, and he was just super shifty, and like he had all this information, and he would just not tell anybody anything that he knew because he just wanted to keep it all for himself. Me as the wizard, like anytime I got close to danger, I would like run away and just kind of shoot things from far away.
He might have almost died a couple times before he started this.
Yes. So I think in my experiences, I think everybody has definitely dug into their characters and played as their character rather than just kind of using their character as a means to an end.
Now, I've played, though, with groups, especially when I was playing 4th edition, that was much more mechanical. It was, when we played, you had a full grid board, you had cards that said what powers you had, that the player didn't get in because all they had to do was look down at the cards and say, okay, I know I can do this, and I know I'm exactly this far, and so I can play this as a mechanical game rather than playing this as a storytelling game. And I think that was one of the downfalls that edition led to, and it's not as much fun then. Because then the players aren't having fun with each other, and there's more emphasis on the game master to come up with, how do I make this fun for the people who want this to be fun? Yeah. And how do I make this mechanical for the people who want this to be mechanical?
As opposed to when we were playing, we would have situations where somebody would be like, I need to get out of here. I look at the chandelier. Does the chandelier look heavy? Yes. Okay, so I grab the chandelier with one hand, cut the rope to raise it with the other hand, let the chandelier fall, and it'll pull me up to the next floor. And that's completely out of the box, right? I mean, that's not in the rules anywhere. And so now the game master has to decide, how do we implement that into the mechanics of the game?
Yeah, I think one thing that happened in the extended campaign of D&D that I played as well that was simultaneously really frustrating, but I think added an organic element to the experience, was a lot of times we would forget like the things that we were carrying in our bags, or, I would forget that, Jenna had something that could help me in this circumstance. So I never thought to ask her to use it. And even sometimes I like forgot what I could do or like the spells I could cast, which I think is really organic because, if you think, okay, I'm a wizard, I'm in a dungeon, and all of a sudden this dragon attacks, am I really going to remember the full spread of options that I have, or am I just going to react as quickly as possible and do whatever comes naturally? So I think playing in that more organic rather than mechanical way was sometimes frustrating because I'd look back and say like, oh, I literally had the exact thing to stop this. But I think it was much more genuine than just listing everything out and making sure step by step I could do these things.
A different angle on that, and that was a lot of times the dungeon master was the reality check, right? So the rest of us are thinking, okay, I'm going to cut this rope, the chandelier's going to fall, and like Errol Flynn in a pirate movie, I'm going to raise the ceiling. And the dungeon master says, okay, you cut the rope, and after you are off the ground, you swing towards the center of the room, and the chandelier hits you on the way down. You have to roll to see if you let go of the rope. And it's like, yeah, that didn't work as well as I thought it was going to.
I don't know how many times my wife almost always plays an archer when we play, which is great that she plays with us. I don't know how many times I've heard her say, can I set that arrow on fire and then shoot it at someone? Because that's going to work out real great, and the arrow's not going to burn before it hits them.
I do remember that question being asked several times. So if you've never played a role-playing game, one of the main mechanics that institutes actions, allows you to do actions, or doesn't allow you to do actions is rolling dice. So Brent, can you talk a little bit about, as a dungeon master, how kind of rolling dice helps form the world or form what players are doing or what they can do?
So I'm first going to say, as a game master, a dungeon master, whatever you want to call it, I'm not great because I don't have the creative nature, so I focus on the dice and I focus on the mechanic of the game. I do that a little more than most will. But the dice are important. And what Shane was saying is, even from character generation, the most popular way to generate a character is you roll dice to see how powerful any of your statistics are. And then you have some choice as to where you put the numbers and as they fall. But you might end up with a wizard who can't cast half his spells because he can't roll worth a darn.
Not smart enough.
He saw them, he learned them, but he couldn't actually use them, or couldn't use them effectively. Beyond that, every action, like Frank was talking about, if you're going to do some out-of-the-box action, you're going to ask the game master, and the game master is going to tell you whether A, it succeeds, B, it fails, and you never could do it, or C, whether you roll and decide whether that succeeds or fails. And he's going to set, or she's going to set some number in their brain that your dice have to hit. And then based on what numbers you have on your sheets and what modifiers, whether you hit that number is either possible or impossible. And the same with that's the main mechanic in battles in the games is you're rolling dice to see whether they're hitting you, you're hitting them, how you're defending, how you're blocking. And then the game master is in charge of narrating that for you and how that works out. The challenge for, I think, the game master is, when do I follow my dice and let those numbers be the numbers on the table, and when do I say my characters need a win or my characters need to die, and play that out that way, even though the dice aren't working for you that day.
Right, because one of the things in previous episode, the one where we talked about co-op games, talked about team games, which are multi versus one. In something like Fury of Dracula, the goal of the Dracula player, who's the one, is to win the game. But it always felt to me, and I'd love to hear you guys' opinion, the role of the game master / dungeon master in a role-playing game is to allow for the other players to have fun. Even if that means, okay, I rolled this roll, but I rolled behind my screen, so nobody knows what it is, and I'm going to fudge this roll, because if this roll happens this way, it's going to ruin the game for everybody, and that's what we don't want.
Yeah, I think that's a really tough balance because you want everybody to have fun and feel like they're successful,
And
but it
challenge.
needs to be challenging enough that it's not just, oh, we're walking through the woods and we all of a sudden find, the greatest
Treasure.
weapon ever designed in treasure, right? So it's a balance between being accomplishable but also being really difficult and challenging at the same time. Brent, I think that's where you've had really good balance. Whereas you say you're not necessarily as creative or creating the world. I think luckily our group was pretty good at, the players were doing that ourselves and kind of designing and exploring. But I think you had a really good balance of making it challenging but also accessible. Now, at one point, Josh went into a castle and tried to reason with a dragon and got us all annihilated. But outside of that experience, I felt like it was all pretty even and pretty balanced. So
that's what I was going to say. I don't necessarily even think it's about the players having fun. I think it's about them having an experience. So I think there are times where someone goes into a pit of a dragon before they're ready. They should die.
yes.
And maybe they're not going to like that. They're going to have to remake a character and start over with a whole new personality. But that doesn't mean that it shouldn't happen just because that's not going to be fun for them, because that's what they're going to remember. They're going to remember, oh crap, we can't just walk in on a dragon and say, hey, you, give us what we want. Because that's not how it works.
Yeah, but I also think
Okay.
there's a difference between that and, the circumstance where everybody on the team is rolling. So a lot of the times you're rolling a 20-sided die, right? 20's the best, 1's the worst. Circumstances are times you're sitting down to play where everybody's rolling 1 to 5s, and as the game master, you're rolling 19s and 20s all day. There's a difference between that and saying, okay, well, this roll I might roll a 20, but I'll count it as a 13. Between that or some stupid player running into the mouth of a dragon and getting eaten.
Although even there, you have options, right? I mean, and I agree, it's not about fun necessarily in the moment. It is about experience. Although, in that case, where somebody potentially just threw water on everybody else's experience, right? Because they did something stupid.
It would have been great if it worked.
Even there, you as a game master, you could, and I'm not saying you should under those circumstances, and I wasn't in that game, so I certainly don't know, but you could say, okay, now you've all woken up from a communal dream, and they're all still alive, and blah, blah, blah. My point being that you have that kind of freedom as the game master to modify the game. Not that you should necessarily use it, but you do have the freedom.
So one of the things I like about the 5th edition system that they put out there for Dungeons & Dragons is very early in the game, your character is weak. It's not uncommon, if goblins attack you,
You get
someone
wiped out.
might die, or the whole party
Yeah.
might die. But
Yeah.
it's going to happen within the first 3 to 5 levels. So you're not going to have put a whole lot of time or a whole lot of energy into making this character personal necessarily. I mean, some people do. Some people do it before the game ever starts. But it's unlikely that you've done too much of that before you get there. So it makes sure that early game, the game master can teach their characters. You're going to have to be careful. Or they can teach them the opposite and say, you only had 5 hit points, but you never die. And kind of set the
Yeah.
flavor for future
Right.
adventures there.
And the characters develop, even if you don't put a lot of energy into the personality of your character, there's enough story back there. By the time they hit 6, 7, 10 levels, there's enough history to this character, even just within the game, even without a backstory, that I remember going into a dungeon one time and one of the guys had like a 12th level knight whose name was Ivan Spade, playing off of Ivanhoe. He got hit with a critical hit from the dungeon masters, one of their weak, lucky crossbowmen, and it killed him. And I'm not kidding. We sat there for like 5 minutes not knowing what to do because this guy was a legend in the group and now he's dead. It pretty much shut down the night because it had that much now emotional investment in that character.
Yeah, I was going to say something we're dancing around a little bit is, in a regular board game, say a Settlers of Catan, you sit down and play, you kind of get invested, but like you lose, whatever, you go home, you had a good time, you played a game. With a lot of role-playing games, there's a deeper emotional investment in your characters and in the game. And in some ways, that takes a lot more commitment than playing a classic board game because, you're investing in this character, you're spending time. A lot of players, you'll buy your miniature and paint it and make it look good. You get dice that you like. And so you really make an investment into your character and into this game that maybe necessarily wouldn't be made into, you sit down once and play a board game. And I think that's a huge strength of role-playing games. But I think that's also, that type of commitment is something that turns people off to them as well. Because they just want to have a casual experience rather than this deeper investment of time and emotion into the game and the character.
So I think that part of the reason that I don't get to play anymore is just, life happens. And especially as a game master, but even as the characters, as game master, I would spend, I remember one time we went up for a vacation and I spent 4 hours while my wife was busy doing something else, reviewing the pre-built stuff and finding out everything and writing notes on it and preparing for our characters to go in there where they spent 20 minutes. It's a lot of time and effort that you got to do up front or behind the scenes that just not everybody has time for.
Right. And one of the things I'm going to pull something that Shane walked right up to and didn't quite express, and that is a lot of times if you're playing a campaign, you're playing not a role-playing game, you're playing a sequence of role-playing games, typically that may have a quest tied to it, and the characters continue on and on and build, right? So this character, whereas in Catan, you might put an hour and a half into it and you're done, and you're not playing a character, you're just playing. In this, you're playing a character that you've built a story around, and this character now has 20 hours of playtime behind him. You've now invested 20 hours of your life into this character, and that's now painful to lose. And it's really hard as you get older and you've got a house and everything else to fit in.
And I think an interesting question for me and all that too is, when is the game done? A role-playing game could go on forever.
Oh, yeah.
So in your experiences, I mean, how do you make an end to that instance or that circumstance of that role-playing game? How do you end it?
We never did.
Never did.
No, we might get done with a quest, but then the game master was creating a new quest for those characters to continue in, and we literally stopped playing role-playing games because we all got married about within 2 or 3 years of each other, all bought houses, had kids, and it all just kind of unraveled. It just didn't happen anymore. So
I've never gracefully exited from a game, either as a player or as a game master. It's always been a fade away. Even when we've lost characters, when we've recreated new ones, it's always been a 1 week we're playing and the next week we can't find time to schedule for 5 months and then it falls off the table. So
I feel like the mood just got so sad and somber
So,
thinking about all of these characters that we've just left behind in our worlds, just to vanish away.
So, but part of the benefit of a role playing game is you're not really playing to win, right?
It's the
As you would a
experience.
board game. You're playing to enjoy I guess, the storytelling aspect as much as anything else.
So I think this weakness is where a game like the Pathfinder card game or Conan bring a strength to a casual player, where they can participate in this RPG style game, but not necessarily invest as much time or emotion as playing an extended campaign of Dungeons and Dragons or an extended campaign of the classic Pathfinder, because things are a little bit more defined, because there can be an end to it. I
Okay,
know.
so take a minute and describe those two games. Describe
Okay.
Pathfinder, the adventure card game first.
So Pathfinder, the adventure card game, at least in my experience of it, I joined after like one or two sessions, but I joined into the game that we were all playing. And you build your character by building your deck. So your deck represents all of the equipment that your character is carrying, all the spells that your character might know, any other traits that your character might have is built in your deck. And there are pre-written or available there are pre-written adventures that you can go on with all of your characters. So, you start out with a pretty thin deck with your character at level 1, you can't do a whole lot of stuff. As the game progresses and as you achieve quests, you start adding these items to your deck so that you can do more things, you can fight better, all those kind of things. At the same time, you do have a character card that you're leveling up with different skills. So in our game, we went through probably 9 or 10 different times we got together and went through these quests. And at the end, there wasn't, a big conclusion like, okay, and we all die happy of old age, our characters. But there did seem to be a natural conclusion to the end of
There was an end to the storyline.
the storyline. So that, although it was, a commitment of, say, 10 to 12 sessions together, it was a predefined story arc, right? We were going
Right.
to start at one point and end at one point. So for a more casual, obviously not super casual, but a more casual gamer, they know we're going to get together 10 times and that's going to be this role-playing game experience.
Okay, so now describe Conan.
Conan, I've only played once, and we sat down and it was like a 2-hour circumstance where we were in this building and we had to fight, the main boss. There were 2 kind of sub-bosses that we had to fight, and we were all characters within the Conan universe. And so we weren't leveling up, we weren't necessarily gaining a lot of stuff other than what was on the board. But it was kind of this enclosed space where we could accomplish this task of killing this boss within that 1.5 to 2 hour time period.
I'm gonna say Conan is really a battle in a Dungeons and Dragons campaign.
It's a skirmish
So it's a
within.
One of the
skirmish.
big
Yes.
battles.
Yeah.
You're not gonna have any role playing, any story getting to it, any story leaving it. I mean, there's a little bit of written narrative, but none of it that you're participating in. It's you show up for this battle, and this is who you are, and this is what you're doing. You can still get into the character because the characters are classic literature and they follow stereotypes there, but you are playing just a battle, and then you're going to probably walk away from it for a while.
And it is more mechanical than role-playing game. But it does give you the feel of the skirmish part of playing a role-playing game. Just the skirmish part, but it does give you that. So what I would add to that, for those of you who haven't played a role-playing game, one of the huge differences between playing either one of those board games, Pathfinder, the adventure game, card game, or Conan, versus playing an actual RPG, is Brent was talking about the time investment, in particular for the game master, who it's probably 4, 5, 10 to 1 that you're putting in compared to the actual playtime. And that doesn't exist in those games because it's defined enough, the rule sets are closed, and the scenario is pre-designed, so they tend to be, in fact, both of those games, I take that back. In Conan, there's kind of a game master role, the overlord, and then there's players playing cooperative, so it's a team versus one game. Pathfinder, the adventure card game, is fully cooperative. You're playing against the game system.
Yeah, and I just think there's a great spot for those games in the gaming experience, that those who want a little bit of an RPG flavor but don't have the time to invest into a full RPG, I think those games fulfill a really critical role between the board game experience and the RPG experience.
So we've talked about role-playing games, we've talked about role-playing substitutes, we've talked about a couple of them, but so far we've only talked about fantasy. Have you guys played any other role-playing games? Because there's like If you name a genre, there's a role-playing game for it.
I haven't. I know a lot of them are based off of the three, I believe, rule set from D&D because they made it open source. And
Right.
that's when they really took the rules and started expanding this out in multi-generation. But I haven't played any of them, so.
I haven't played either. I've seen a few where I've gone to like a card shop or comic book shop. I've seen a few being played. I think I've seen a Star Wars one being played, but I haven't played any other than the D&D, and then the two kind of RPG board games that I talked about.
So for those listeners who are curious, but fantasy is not their thing, Shane mentioned the Star Wars role-playing game. There is a Star Trek role-playing game. I don't know where this is at because I will date myself by talking about the role-playing games I know because they're all from the 80s and 90s. But there was one called Boot Hill, which was a Western one. There was one called Traveler, which actually the idea of Traveler, I think that was the name of it, was that you could play, it was a way to link Boot Hill and D&D and take whatever game system you want and make you kind of like a Time Lord kind of a thing where you went around and bounced around. But there are ones for post-apocalyptic worlds.
So I will say in the fifth edition Dungeon Master Guide, which is still what it's called, there are rules for things like ammunition and gun systems, specifically so that you could take the rule set and use the same general theme or same characteristics of the game and put any flavor over top of it. You could set it as a Western out in the middle of nowhere, or a space odyssey, or
Yeah, and
you
we've
know,
talked about doing ones like a Crusade or
right.
things like that, yeah.
And I mean, so a lot of them I think are more based around a fantasy sword, shield, bashing, and spell kind of thing. But I know there are rule sets that also bring in weapons that are more modern, so that you can play those kind of games, and you can take out any of the spells or the magic or any of that if you wanted,
So
and still get the same game.
So what's interesting there, just as kind of a final note, is we did try and play a historical one time without magic. And it was really boring because there wasn't any like big surprise in it. Arthur C. Clarke made the quote one time, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, right? So I really think that's part of the reason why you see a whole lot of role-playing games, either in fantasy or in science fiction or in a steampunk world, which I guess is really a type of science fiction. But it's because you have something that is magical, regardless of whether it's magic or whatever. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think playing within a magical realm really opens up a lot more possibilities, right? Because if you're playing historical, I mean, there's good guys and bad guys, and they shoot each other, right?
Right.
But when you get into that fantasy world, the magical realm, I mean, you've got goblins and, ghosts and flaming skulls that show up when you run into a room and dragons. And I think just the possibilities are a lot wider than playing within a more historical or kind of classic world.
And I think beyond that, some of the reason that people enjoy the game so much is that they get to make a character that they probably wouldn't be in real life.
Right.
Even if it has elements of their
Yes.
real life personality, they get to imagine themselves as something that's not real, and then play that aspect. And so if you take away some of that magic or some of that mysticism or whatever,
The mystery. I think it's
mystery, sure. I mean, you're not having the same experience. You're not escaping the same way, and you might as well just go out and do something in real life.
Absolutely. And I think, you mentioned steampunk. I think steampunk really provides like kind of a familiar space, but also like you add that kind of extra element into it of,
Right.
right? Like we're kind of in a world that's familiar, but like we have these extraordinary capabilities as well
Right.
added into it.
And not only can you be superhuman in some sense, but also that one guy that's out there left on the battlefield who's a wizard or got some crazy armor in a steampunk world with this weapon you've never seen before. In a real world, they're gonna take out guys one at a time, maybe a couple at a time if they got a machine gun.
Yeah.
But this guy might have a thermonuclear device equivalent that only he can survive, so you have no idea what the destructive power of that guy is. You have no idea. You mentioned a flaming skull in a room. You have no idea. Is that just a flaming skull as an illusion, or is there something, or is it just the man behind the curtain? You have no idea what that is, right?
And I think that the really hard part without magic is how do you make memorable enemies that survive? how do you make someone when you can, if it's more realistic that you can shoot with a gun from X number of yards away and they're done.
Well,
How do you still make that memorable?
and then, so I'll use a literary example. Which is scarier, right? Vlad the Impaler, or Dracula? The real person is not nearly as scary as this supernatural being that you don't know what all they can do. Anyway.
And the human is already pretty scary, but yeah, to elevate it to, this superhuman vampire character just really adds an element to it that I think you can't accomplish, right? Because Vlad the Impaler, you can walk up and stab him.
Right.
Right, but Dracula transforms into a bat and flies away, and he has all these little minions. I think it really does add to
Or
it.
mesmerizes you and then sucks you dry, and you end up being the guy who loses out.
I hate it when things like that happen.
So here's what I would say as a conclusion. If you have not played a role-playing game, but you're interested in gaming, there are conventions and the like where you can get involved in a role-playing game for a session as a player and not invest any more time than you would in any other board game. I think it's an experience that every gamer ought to have. It's a fantastically fun time, and you can do it with a minimum investment just to get a feel for what it's like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, another great opportunity, as I said, with Brent one time we did just a one night campaign. And so if within your game group there's somebody that's willing to invest, in kind of a one night campaign, I think that's a great way to start getting involved in RPG or at least to see if you enjoy kind of that genre or that mechanic, is do just like a one night, one kind of hit thing. Or as I said, check out a board game that really introduces the flavor of RPG as well.
And because fantasy does sometimes have a stigma to it, and there are a lot of people who still won't let their kids play it or any of that nature. There are plenty of opportunities to pull it out of that genre and put it in something else to get the same imagination, cooperation, character building without some of that stigma that buries some of these games.
Yeah, absolutely. We've, working in the church, I've had many conversations about, what are the implications of these types of games and really diving into this world of magic and horror or whatever it is. And really, RPG is what you make of it. It's about the people sitting around the table. You walk away with fun stories to tell. I mean, in our D&D group, Brent, we still razz each other on stupid decisions that we made. Josh running in and trying to reason with a dragon, or Tommy continually running through the room with the flaming skull and nearly getting killed, every 3 minutes. So, it's all about the people. It's all about the experience that you're having together, and ultimately, that's why we're here. That's why we're gaming. That's why we have this podcast to share with you our experiences, our stories, and hopefully you'll get some stories of your own to share too.
This has been the Analog Gamers Podcast. You can find us at theanaloggamers.libsyn.com. You can email us at theanaloggamers@gmail.com or find us on Facebook as The Analog Gamers. The Analog Gamers Podcast is licensed under attribution, no commercial, non-derivative, Creative Commons 3.0 license.